A parole board reads a file, signs a form, and a man walks back into a neighborhood like yours. This is 5 cases in which the system opened the door and someone else paid for it with everything. 15 years served. Then a quiet transfer to a city that was never warned. What did the state of New York already know about Arthur? Rochester, New York, in the spring of 1987 was a city of 2 faces. On one side stood the great names that had built it, the camera plants and the copier lines and the lens grinders, the sprawling brick campuses where thousands of men and women clocked in for shifts that came with pensions and dental plans and a sense of permanence. On the other side, 3 miles west of those gates ran Lyell Avenue. It was a straight, flat commercial strip on the city's northwest side. A corridor of auto body shops and corner taverns and low wooden storefronts with peeling paint and hand-lettered signs. By day, it looked like any tired working-class artery in any northern industrial town. Delivery trucks idled at the curb. Men in coveralls ate lunch on tailgates. Kids cut across the vacant lots on their way home from school. But when the sun dropped behind the roof lines and the sodium streetlights came on, the avenue changed. The light turned that particular orange that flattens every face and makes every color look like rust, and the women came out to work. They were not statistics. They were people with names their mothers had chosen and childhoods spent in the same neighborhoods they now walked. Many of them had grown up within a few blocks of Lyell Avenue in houses with sagging porches and radiators that knocked all winter. Most were caught in a cycle that had started with something small, a bad relationship, a lost job, a first pill, and had tightened around them 1 year at a time. They had children being raised by grandmothers and sisters and aunts. They had birthdays they still celebrated with a cheap cake in somebody's kitchen. They had plans, real ones, about getting clean and getting a room of their own and getting their kids back. And they had a system, because nobody else was going to provide one for them. They watched each other. They memorized license plates and repeated them out loud to a friend before they got into a car. They warned one another about the men who liked to argue about money and the men who wanted to drive too far out of the city. They kept a rough census in their heads of who was working which corner on which night, and they noticed when someone was missing from it. That informal network was the only real protection they had, because the official one had effectively closed for business where they were concerned. A woman with a record for street offenses who did not come home for 3 days was not treated as a crisis. She was treated as a woman who had gone somewhere. Maybe a boyfriend, maybe a jail cell in another county, maybe a bus to Buffalo. When friends did walk into a police station to report someone gone, the paperwork often did not survive the conversation. Because there was no fixed address to check, no employer to call, no family member insisting on daily updates. The women knew this about themselves and about the city. They talked about it openly. They understood that if something happened to them out there in the orange light, the search would be conducted mostly by other women wearing thin coats and asking around the same 12 blocks. And they had no way of knowing that in the spring of that same year, a middle-aged man had arrived in Rochester with the help of the state of New York. He was quiet, he was heavyset and going bald, and he wore a work jacket and rode a bicycle around the west side. He got a job in food service, the sort of job where you keep your head down and mop what you are told to mop. He had a girlfriend, and he had a woman on the side, and neither of them found him frightening. To the neighbors on his street, he was a dull, harmless fixture. The kind of man you nod at while carrying groceries and then forget completely. He had been relocated to the city by parole officials after 2 other communities in New York State learned exactly who he was and made it impossible for him to stay. In Rochester, nobody was told, not the neighbors, not the women on Lyell Avenue, not the officers who patrolled it. The break in the census came in the middle of March, 1988. Dorothy Blackburn was 27 years old and known up and down the avenue. She had family in the city and a face people recognized, and she was reliable in the way that street life allows anyone to be reliable. Which is to say, her friends knew her patterns and knew where she would turn up. On the 15th of March, those patterns stopped. She was not on her corner. She was not in the diner. She was not at the apartment where she sometimes slept. Her friends did what they always did. They asked. They walked the blocks. They checked the drunk tank and the hospital and the names of men she had been seen with. 9 days went by with no answer from anyone. Now picture the geography, because the geography is the whole case. The Genesee River enters Rochester from the south and runs north through the middle of it, dropping over a series of falls into a deep tree-choked gorge before it empties into Lake Ontario. That gorge is minutes from downtown, and yet it is wild, steep, and largely unwatched to the west past the city line. Monroe County flattens into farmland and orchards and small towns, roughly 20 miles out that way, near the village of Brockport. Salmon Creek winds through the town of Sweden, crossed here and there by 2-lane blacktop and shoulderless bridges where you can stop a car at night and not see another headlight for 10 minutes. That is where Dorothy Blackburn was found on the 24th of March, 1988, in the shallow water of the creek, more than a half-hour drive from the corner where she had last been seen alive. The medical examiner determined she had been deprived of air. Her death was ruled a homicide. Here is where the system began to fail in a way that would cost 10 more lives. Dorothy Blackburn went missing inside the city of Rochester, which meant the Rochester Police Department. She was found in the town of Sweden, which meant the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. 2 agencies, 2 case files, 2 sets of detectives, and no mechanism that automatically stitched the front end of the story to the back end of it. The city had a woman who had vanished from a street where women vanishing did not generate headlines. The county had an unidentified circumstance in a creek bed 20 miles from that street, with no witnesses, no vehicle, and no crime scene at all in the traditional sense, because the place where she died was not the place where she was left. Then months passed with nothing further, and the file cooled. In July, a woman named Anna Marie Steffen disappeared from the same neighborhood. Her remains were not located until September, and they were found in the Genesee River Gorge, inside the city this time, in a place the water and the weather had worked on for weeks. 2 women, gone from the same 12 blocks, left in 2 different jurisdictions, in 2 different bodies of water, with 2 different sets of investigators writing 2 different reports. On paper, they were unrelated on Lyell Avenue, where the women kept their own records in their own heads. Nobody believed that for a second. The rest of 1988 passed without another woman going missing from the avenue. And that silence did more damage than any false lead could have. In the city, the Dorothy Blackburn file sat with detectives who had no scene, no vehicle, and no witness who could place her in a car on the night of the 15th of March. In the county, the deputies who had worked Salmon Creek had a location and nothing else. Anna Marie Steffen came out of the gorge in September, and the weeks the water and weather had worked on her left the medical examiner with almost nothing to describe beyond the fact that she had not simply drowned. Investigators in both agencies did the work available to them. They pulled arrest records for the corridor. They interviewed the men whose names came up in the women's accounts of bad customers. They checked the county jail rosters, the state hospital admissions, the Buffalo and Syracuse bus depots. They wrote their reports and filed them, and the files went into 2 different cabinets in 2 different buildings, and nobody put them side by side on a desk. Meanwhile, a heavy-set man in his 40s clocked in for his shift at a wholesale food company on the west side, where his job was to prepare salads and vegetables for delivery. He rode a bicycle to work. He fished the Genesee Gorge on his days off, which is a thing hundreds of men in Rochester did, and nobody looks twice at a man with a rod walking down toward the water to understand how he came to be there. You have to go back to Watertown, New York, in 1972, and to a plea agreement that a mature audience will find hard to sit through. That May, a 10-year-old boy named Jack Owen Blake went out of his house in Watertown and never came home. That September, an 8-year-old girl named Karen Ann Hill, visiting her grandmother for the weekend, was found under a bridge in the same city. The man arrested for her death was a local laborer with a prior record for arson and burglary. Prosecutors had a strong case in the girl's death and almost nothing in the boy's, and so they made a trade. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter in the first degree, and in exchange he walked investigators into the woods and showed them where the boy was. One plea, one sentence, 25 years for 2 children, and under the sentencing structure of that era, 25 years was not 25 years. It was a maximum subject to good behavior credits and to the discretion of the parole board. He served 14 and a half years. In 1987, the board voted to release him. The file that went with him contained psychiatric evaluations, and those evaluations did not describe a rehabilitated man. What happened next is the part that should have been impossible. He was released in the spring of 1987 to Binghamton, New York. Word of who he was reached the neighborhood, and the reaction was immediate and total. Parole officials moved him. The next placement, in a small community in Delaware County, ended the same way. New York State in 1987 had no public registry of released offenders, no notification statute, and no legal obligation for the Division of Parole to inform a local police department that it was placing a man with that history inside their city limits. There was only an internal decision to be made about how much noise a placement would generate. So in June of 1987, parole officials brought him to Rochester, a city of 230,000 people, large enough to absorb one quiet man on a bicycle. They did not tell the Rochester Police Department. They did not tell the neighbors on his street. And they did not tell the women on Lyell Avenue, 12 blocks from where he lived, who kept the only real census of who was alive and who was missing on the west side. He reported to his parole officer he kept his job. He was, by every administrative measure, a success story. Then it started again, and this time it did not stop. Dorothy Keeler was 59 years old and known around the neighborhood as someone who had been on those blocks longer than most of the younger women had been alive. She was last seen in July of 1989. Patricia Ives was 25, and she went missing that autumn. Frances Brown was 22. June Stott was 30, and she was not a working woman at all. Which is important because it meant the danger had stepped outside the boundary the city had drawn around it. On the avenue, the informal network lit up. Women stopped taking rides. They started refusing to leave the strip. They told each other to write down plate numbers twice, once out loud and once on paper. They walked into police stations and said, out of their own mouths, that someone was hunting them. Detectives in the city took statements and worked the corridor, canvassing bars and rooming houses and the drivers who cruised it, and they ran the same names they had run the year before. But there was still no single file. There was still no single map. The women who had been taken were being left in the gorge, in the creeks, in the fields of the surrounding towns, and each discovery landed on a different agency's desk. October of 1989 broke the wall. On the 21st, Dorothy Keeler was located. On the 27th, Patricia Ives was found in the city in a vacant lot behind a building on the west side. France Brown came out of the ground near Seth, Green Drive on the slope above the Genesee, in early November. Now the pattern was undeniable, and a task force was assembled that finally put the Rochester Police Department, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, and the New York State Police at the same table, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation brought in for support. Rochester Police Captain Lynd Johnston took operational command. The task force did what should have been done in March of 1988. They laid the cases out chronologically. They pinned the disposal locations to a wall map. They cross-referenced every woman's known associates against every other woman's. They opened a tip line and began processing hundreds of calls, and each call had to be run out, which meant men were named, interviewed, and cleared over and over while the calendar kept moving. Investigators looked hard at men with histories of violence against women, at drivers who worked the corridor, at anyone whose name surfaced twice. None of it produced a suspect, because the man they wanted had no local record at all. His record was 300 miles away in a Jefferson County courthouse, and nothing in Rochester was connected to it. November and December were the worst weeks in the city's memory. June Stott was recovered on the 23rd of November in the same general area along the river where Frances Brown had been found, and that repetition mattered more than anything else on the wall map. 4 days later, on the 27th, a woman named Elizabeth Gibson was located in Wayne County east of Rochester, which added a third county and a fourth agency to the paperwork. Maria Welch, 22 years old, had gone missing on the 5th of November. Darlene Trippi, 32, disappeared on the 15th of December. Felicia Stevens was 20 and vanished on the 28th of December, and she was last seen being pulled into a car on the avenue itself. As 1989 ended, the task force had 8 recovery sites and at least 3 women unaccounted for, whose locations nobody knew. Police walked the corridor handing out flyers, urging the women to stay off the street. And the women had to weigh that warning against rent and food and the physical demands of addiction. Some of them stopped working, some of them could not, and through all of it, the man on the bicycle went to his shift and came home and borrowed a car from a woman who trusted him, and drove it out past the city line at night, on shoulderless 2-lane roads where you can stop and not see another headlight for 10 minutes. The breakthrough did not come from a fingerprint or a fiber. It came from a behavioral analysis. Working with the Bureau's behavioral science personnel, the task force built a profile of a local man, familiar with the back roads and the water, who was not passing through and not hiding far away, and who was doing something that experienced analysts had seen before. He was going back. The reuse of the Seth Green Drive slope proved it. The clustering along Salmon Creek proved it. So the task force made a decision that reversed the entire logic of the investigation. Instead of chasing the man across the city, they would sit on the ground he kept returning to. Now hold the geography in your head. 20 miles west of downtown, past the flat, orchard country, Salmon Creek runs through Northampton Park and passes under a low bridge on Route 31. A straight stretch of blacktop with room on the shoulder for one car. In early January, the creek was frozen. Anything left in that ice would stay visible from the air. New York State Police Aviation began flying the river and the creeks, low and slow, with an investigator in the passenger seat watching the ground. On the morning of the 3rd of January 1990, the helicopter lifted off in cold, flat winter light and turned west. The aircraft flew low, following the line of the water close enough that the rotor wash bent the dead reeds along the banks. Below it, Salmon Creek lay locked in ice, a gray ribbon threading through Northampton Park and out under the 2-lane blacktop of Route 31. At around 11 in the morning, the helicopter passed over that low bridge, and the investigator in the passenger seat looked down and saw 2 things at once. There was a car parked on the bridge deck, pulled onto the narrow shoulder with room for nothing else beside it. A heavy-set man in a work jacket stood at the rail, looking down at the creek, and in the ice below him, half locked into the frozen surface, was a pale shape that did not belong there. The pilot did not circle. He kept his heading, banked away as though the flight were routine, and radioed the ground. Because the one thing the task force could not afford, after 22 months and 11 women, was to spook the man on the bridge. The aircraft came back around at a distance and held him in view. The car pulled off the bridge and headed east. It was a blue Chevrolet, and it did not belong to the man driving it. Unmarked units picked him up on the road and followed him for miles through the flat orchard country, past the frost-heaved shoulders and the mailboxes leaning at the ends of long driveways. He drove within the speed limit. He signaled his turns. He stopped at a nursing home a few miles away, where a woman he knew was working her shift, and he parked and walked in like a man visiting a friend on his day off, which is exactly what he was. Investigators approached him in the lot. They asked him to come and answer some questions about a car and a bridge. He agreed without argument. He was polite, he was cooperative, he gave them his name, and somewhere in the public safety building in downtown Rochester, that name went into a records check. And the answer came back from a courthouse 300 miles away in Jefferson County. The man sitting in the interview room was Arthur John, 44 years old, employed in food preparation at a wholesale company on the west side, resident of Rochester since June of 1987. He was on parole. He had served 14 and a half years for the deaths of 2 children in Watertown. In 2 years of canvassing the corridor, running names and clearing hundreds of tips, the task force had never once had his name on a list, because nobody in the city of Rochester had ever been told he was there. The interview ran for the better part of 12 hours. Arthur John began where men like him always begin. He was a working man. He fished the creeks and the gorge. He had stopped on the bridge to eat his lunch. He knew nothing about any women, and he had never heard of Lyell Avenue in any way that mattered. Investigators let him talk, and they let him commit to a timeline, because a timeline is a structure, and structures can be pulled apart. They had the car. They had the woman who owned it, who had loaned it to him again and again over 2 years, and who could account for the nights he had it. They had a second woman at home who believed she was living with a quiet, dull, unremarkable man. Both were interviewed. The dates they gave did not match the dates he gave. Investigators walked those contradictions back into the room and set them down in front of him, one at a time. And each time, the friendly man in the work jacket had less floor to stand on. By the early hours of the 4th of January 1990, the mask came off. He began to talk about the women. He named them. He described where he had left them, on the slope above the Genesee, in the fields, in the creek beds out past the city line. In the days that followed, he directed investigators to the locations of the last of the missing, and they were recovered from the places he described. The woman in the ice under the Route 31 bridge was identified as June Cicero, 34 years old, last seen alive on Lyell Avenue in the middle of December. And then he began to build his defense out loud in the interview room before he had ever seen a courtroom. He told investigators he was not responsible because something had been done to him first. He said he had come back from Vietnam broken. He described atrocities in the jungle, and he went further than that, into claims about what he said he had been driven to do to human beings during combat. Delivered in the flat, patient tone of a man laying groundwork, he had been rehearsing a story for years, and he expected it to work. Because it had worked in Watertown in 1972 when a plea agreement handed him 25 years for 2 children. This time, investigators pulled his service record. Arthur John had been in Vietnam. He had served in a rear echelon supply role, handling parts and stock. There was no combat record. There were no jungle patrols, no engagements. Nothing that supported a single sentence of the story he had built his humanity around. The man who had been hiding among them for 2.5 years, nodding at neighbors, riding his bicycle to a shift, chopping vegetables for other people's dinners, was not a damaged soldier. He was a man who had been given back to the public by the state of New York quietly, with no warning to anyone, and who had used that quiet the way a hunter uses tall grass. The trial opened in Monroe County Court in the autumn of 1990 before Judge Donald Wisner, and it turned into a fight over one question. Not whether he had done it. He had confessed, at length, in detail, to locations only he could have known. The question was whether he could be held responsible. The defense mounted an insanity case built on his own account of himself, presenting testimony from psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Oatno Lewis, who described a man fractured by childhood abuse and wartime trauma, with dissociation and possible neurological damage. Jurors were shown material from hypnosis sessions in which he narrated the jungle stories in different voices. Assistant District Attorney Charles Siragopa answered it with the record and with Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist who had reviewed the case file, the service documents, and the man himself. Dr. Dietz testified that Arthur John was not dissociating, he was performing. He was a sexual sadist with an antisocial personality, fully aware of what he was doing, who had chosen women the city had already stopped looking for, and who had produced a trauma narrative because a trauma narrative was the only currency he had left. On the 13th of December 1990, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found him guilty on 10 counts under the state's second-degree homicide statute, the charge New York uses for an intentional killing. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive terms of 25 years to life, 250 years, the maximum available. In 1994, he entered a guilty plea in Wayne County for the death of Elizabeth Gibson, the woman found east of the city in November of 1989, and received another 25 years to life on top of a sentence that already outran his lifespan. What remained was the accounting nobody in Albany wanted to do. In 1987, the Parole Board had voted to release a man whose file contained psychiatric evaluations that did not describe a rehabilitated person. 2 communities had learned who he was and forced him out, and because New York State in 1987 had no offender registry, no notification statute, and no requirement that the Division of Parole tell a local police department who it was placing inside the city limits, he was moved to the largest available population and left there without a word to anyone. Not the neighbors, not the patrol officers on Lyle Avenue, not the women who kept the only real census of who was still alive on the West Side. The case became a permanent exhibit in the state's argument over parole and public notification. An argument that ran through the 1990s and ended with New York enacting sex offender registration and community notification in 1995. 11 families had already paid the tuition for that lesson. Some of them buried women the city had spent 2 years describing as transient. In 2003, when handmade items he produced in prison surfaced for sale to collectors, those same families had to say his name again in public and ask the state to stop it. Arthur John spent the rest of his life in maximum security, most of it at Sullivan Correctional Facility, giving interviews, revising his story, and claiming more than he could ever be charged with. He died on the 10th of November 2008 at a hospital in Albany, at the age of 63 after his heart failed. There was no confession left to give and no one still willing to bargain for one. What the families were left with was the arithmetic of it. If the board had voted differently in 1987, or if one clerk had been required by law to send one notice to one police department, 11 women would have walked home. That is the shape this failure takes when the paperwork stays inside the building. It is not unique to New York, and it is not confined to the 1980s. 22 years later, on the other side of the world, a bright Irish woman named Jill Megger was building a new life in Melbourne, Australia, with her husband working at a broadcaster, learning a city she had chosen. On a Friday night in September of 2012, she went out for drinks with her colleagues on a busy street in Brunswick. And the man she would cross paths with on her short walk home was also at that moment free because of a decision on a page. Brunswick, in the late winter and early spring of the year 2012, was one of those places that felt safe because it never fully went to sleep. Sydney Road ran through the middle of it like a spine, a long, straight artery of shop fronts stretching north out of the center of Melbourne, with tram tracks embedded in the asphalt and overhead wires humming above the traffic. Bridal boutiques with lace gowns in the windows sat beside Lebanese bakeries, Turkish grocers, second-hand furniture stores, and small bars with hand-painted signs. The buildings were mostly 2 stories of Victorian brick, some with peeling paint on the upper facades, awnings sagging over the footpath. At night, the sodium streetlights washed everything in a thin orange glow, and the trams still rattled past well after midnight, sparks flickering at the wires. This was a suburb full of young renters, artists, nurses, students, and media workers. People who walked home from the pub because walking home from the pub was simply what you did. It was crowded, noisy, watched over by hundreds of windows. It felt like the safest kind of city street, the kind where you are never truly alone. Into this neighborhood came a woman of 29 named Jill, born and raised in Ireland, who had moved to the other side of the world with her husband Tom to build something new. Friends described her as quick, funny, and generous with her attention. The sort of person who remembered your problems and asked about them a week later. She had found work as an administrative assistant at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the national public broadcaster, where she supported radio production staff and became known around the building for her sharp humor and her warmth in a workplace that ran on deadlines and nervous energy. Colleagues came to her desk for paperwork and stayed for conversation. She had a soft Irish accent that made Australians ask where she was from within 30 seconds of meeting her. She and Tom had settled into a small apartment in Brunswick, close enough to Sydney Road that they could hear the trams from their bed. They had built the ordinary architecture of a shared life, the shopping lists, the weekend markets, the phone calls home to family in another hemisphere, the running jokes only 2 people understand. Her routine was unremarkable in the way that most happy lives are unremarkable. Coffee in the morning at one of the local cafes, the ones with mismatched chairs on the footpath and the hiss of the milk steamer competing with the traffic. The commute into the city, the office, the emails, the studio corridors, then home again, back up Sydney Road, past the same shop fronts, the same bakeries, the same bridal store windows with their frozen mannequins. On Friday nights, colleagues from the broadcaster would gather at a bar and decompress from the week. On the evening of Friday, September 21st, in the year 2012, Jill joined them at a venue on Sydney Road called Bar Etiquette, a short walk from her front door. The mood was easy drinks, laughter, the noise of a room full of people who had finished work and had nowhere urgent to be. Tom was at home that night. She texted him through the evening, the way couples do, small updates about who was there and when she might leave. Nobody in that room, watching the hours slide past midnight, had any reason to believe that this specific Friday was different from the 50 Fridays before it. Nobody in that room understood that the sense of safety the entire suburb took for granted was about to be broken in a way the city would never fully repair. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning, on Saturday, September 22nd, Jill decided to go home. Her colleagues offered to share a taxi with her. She declined. The reason was not recklessness. The reason was that the walk was almost nothing. A stretch of under 10 minutes along a main road she had traveled hundreds of times. lit by streetlights and shop-front signage, with cars still moving and people still spilling out of late venues. She stepped out onto the footpath and turned to head home along Sydney Road. Around her, the geography was familiar to the point of invisibility. To her left, the long row of retail frontages shutters down for the night. To her right, the tram tracks and the traffic. Behind the shop fronts, threaded between the buildings, ran a network of narrow service laneways, dark corridors barely wide enough for a delivery van, cutting back toward the side streets. Hope Street crossed Sydney Road a short distance ahead of her, and just past that intersection stood a bridal boutique with a security camera mounted above its entrance, pointed out at the footpath. At exactly 1:35 in the morning, she made a phone call to her brother, who lived on the far side of the continent in Western Australia. The reception was poor. The call dropped. She was still on the footpath. She was a few hundred meters from her own front door. Tom was waiting up. When the minutes stretched and she did not come through the door, he did what any partner does. He called her mobile phone. By 2 in the morning, he was calling again. Then again, the phone did not answer. Text messages went unanswered. He told himself the ordinary things a person tells themselves at that hour, that she had gone on to another bar, that she had stopped at a friend's house, that the battery had died. But the apartment stayed quiet, and Sydney Road outside the window kept emptying, and the noise of the night thinned out into the sound of an occasional car. By 4:30 in the morning, Tom was no longer waiting. He was outside, walking the street in the cold, checking the footpaths, the intersections, the laneway entrances behind the shops, calling her name into spaces that gave nothing back. He walked the route she should have walked. It took him almost no time at all, which was precisely the horror of it. There was nowhere for a person to get lost between that bar and that apartment. At 6 in the morning, he walked into a police station and reported his wife missing to Victoria Police. What happened next was unprecedented in Melbourne. Within hours, a page appeared on social media asking for help finding her, and it did not behave like a normal missing person appeal. It detonated. Tens of thousands of people shared her photograph. Then hundreds of thousands her face, smiling, ordinary, familiar, appeared on screens across the entire country. Volunteers walked through parks and along creek paths. Locals stood in their doorways on Sydney Road trying to remember whether they had heard anything at all in the early hours. Police canvassed the strip, business by business, asking one question over and over, whether anyone had a camera pointed at the street. Officers began collecting recordings from every source they could find: private security systems, shopfront, cameras, transport infrastructure, anything that had been recording between 1:30 and 2 in the morning on a stretch of road only a few hundred meters long. Detectives also began the grim standard procedure of every case like this, which is to look hardest and earliest at the person closest to the missing woman. That meant Tom, and while investigators worked through that first weekend, one fact sat in the center of the file, immovable and impossible to explain away. A woman had walked out of a bar onto one of the busiest streets in inner Melbourne, made a phone call at 1:35 in the morning. And then, somewhere inside a few hundred meters of shop fronts, footpath, and dark service laneways, she had simply stopped existing. By Saturday afternoon, the file had moved out of the hands of local uniformed officers and into the homicide squad. And that transfer told you everything about how Victoria Police already read the situation. A missing person case usually begins with hospitals, friends, family, bank cards, and transport records. This one began with geography. Detectives measured the walk themselves, from the door of the bar on Sydney Road to the door of the apartment. And the number they came back with was brutal in its simplicity. Under 1 kilometer, roughly 7 or 8 minutes at an easy pace. Along that stretch, there were no waterways to fall into, no rail cuttings, no bushland, no way for an adult woman to vanish by accident. What there was instead, running behind the shop fronts like a hidden second street, was a lattice of narrow service laneways. Bluestone and asphalt corridors used for deliveries and rubbish collection, most of them unlit, most of them invisible from the footpath unless you were standing directly at the mouth. Detectives walked every one of them. They logged the distance from the bar to each laneway entrance, the sight lines, the doorways deep enough to hold a person standing still. Then they began the part of the work that nobody sees in a television drama. They knocked on every business door along the strip and asked a single question. Do you have a camera, and was it running? Melbourne in the year 2012 was not yet blanketed in high-definition surveillance, and what existed was a patchwork of private systems owned by shopkeepers, most of them recording to old hard drives with the clocks set wrong. Officers seized footage from bottle shops, cab shops, banks, jewelry stores, transport infrastructure, and the little cameras bolted above doorways to watch for graffiti. Analysts sat in front of hundreds of hours of grainy video, correcting each timestamp against a known reference so that separate cameras could be stitched into one honest timeline. At the same time, the search on the ground expanded outward. State Emergency Service volunteers in orange overalls walked the parkland and the creek corridors north of the suburb. Officers lifted drain covers. They searched dumpsters behind the shops, rooftops, vacant blocks, and the yards of buildings under renovation. And the detectives did the thing every family dreads and every experienced investigator insists upon. They looked hardest at the husband. Tom was interviewed at length. His movements, his phone, his relationship, his finances. All of it went under the microscope while he was still walking the streets looking for his wife. The answer came from telecommunications data, and it was absolute. In those early hours, Tom's mobile phone was pinging off towers along Sydney Road exactly where he had said he was. Searching. Jill's phone was doing something else entirely. Her handset had traveled north and west out of Brunswick and onto the Dulta Marine Freeway. Tom was eliminated, and the case tilted toward a truth far more frightening. Someone had taken her out of the city. On Wednesday, September 26th, detectives made a decision that would change the case. They released a short piece of footage recovered from a camera mounted above the entrance of a bridal boutique near the corner of Hope Street. A shop with pale gowns standing in the window like sentries. The images were poor. A woman in a light-colored top walks along the footpath. A man in a blue hooded top stands close to her. In conversation, his face turned partly away from the lens. The two figures are together for less than a minute, then the frame empties. Police published stills of the man and asked the country to look at him. What detectives already knew, and had not said publicly, was that the same figure had been on that strip for a long stretch of the night, and that he had approached other women before her. What nobody knew yet was that the entire encounter had ended within a few hundred meters, and within a handful of minutes. Residents in the apartments and terraces near Hope Street would later tell investigators that shortly before 1:45 in the morning they had heard a woman calling out. The sound of a struggle in the dark behind the shops, and then a silence that arrived too fast. Some had assumed it was drunken noise on a Friday night. It was not. Toll road records would later show that a vehicle registered in the northern suburbs passed back through the network at 22 minutes past 4 that same morning. Whatever had happened in that laneway had happened quickly, and someone had come back for her. The public response to the footage was immediate and enormous. Crime Stoppers took a flood of calls. Detectives cross-referenced the man's build, his gait and his clothing against police intelligence holdings, against registered sex offenders living within striking distance of Sydney Road, and against parolees under supervision in the northern suburbs. The name that surfaced belonged to a 41-year-old man living in Coburg, a suburb sitting directly north of Brunswick, close enough that Sydney Road runs through both. His name was Adrian Ernest. He worked in concreting. He had a girlfriend, a house, a car, and a routine, and to his neighbors he was nobody in particular, a solid-built man in a hooded top loading tools into a hatchback. That car was a Holden Estra. Investigators pulled the toll road data and matched it against the movement of Jill's mobile phone. A toll point on Moreland Road photographed the Estra passing through at the same moment her handset registered on the network moving along the freeway. Two independent data streams, one from a telephone company and one from a toll operator, laid side by side, pointing at the same vehicle at the same second. On Thursday, September 27th, 5 days after she stepped out of that bar, police arrested him. Then the file opened, and what was inside it turned grief into public fury. This was not an unknown quantity. In the year 1990, at 19 years old, he had been convicted of a serious sexual offense. In March of the year 2002, he was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment with a minimum of 8 for a series of violent sexual attacks on 5 women in the St. Kilda area. Offenses so calculated that the sentencing judge described a pattern of predatory behavior. He was released on parole in the year 2010 under the supervision of the Adult Parole Board of Victoria. In the middle of the year 2011, while still on parole, he attacked a man outside a hotel in Geelong and fractured his jaw. He pleaded guilty. In March of the year 2012, a court sentenced him to 3 months' imprisonment for that assault. Here is where the machinery failed, and it failed on paperwork and procedure rather than on any single villain. He lodged an appeal against that sentence. Pending the appeal, he was released. And the Adult Parole Board, informed of a fresh conviction for a violent offense committed by a serial sexual offender in its own care, did not cancel his parole. The board's practice was to wait for the appeal to be resolved before acting. So the paperwork sat in a queue, the appeal sat in a court list, and the man sat in his house in Coburg free. 6 months before Jill walked home along Sydney Road, while he was being questioned, a second team executed a search warrant at the Coburg property. The scene examiners moved through the house with a discipline that would matter enormously later in court. Items were bagged individually in specialized paper evidence bags rather than plastic, because plastic traps moisture, degrades biological material. And sealed bags shared between items invite cross-contamination that a defense barrister can drive a truck through. They seized a blue jumper, and inside the residence, they found something that could not be explained away by coincidence or bad luck: Jill's SIM card. Removed from her phone, kept hidden in the home of a man who had told detectives he had never met her. The interview ran close to 10 hours. He denied, he offered versions. He shifted. Detectives laid out the toll gantry image, the phone data, the footage, the jumper, the SIM card, and the version he was telling collapsed under its own weight. He then said he had argued with his girlfriend that night, that it had left him angry and aggressive, and that he had carried that state into what he did to her. He admitted he had ended her life with his hands then, flatly. He told them where she was. By 10 o'clock that night, a convoy was moving out of the city. The destination was Black Hill Road at Gisborne South, roughly 50 kilometers northwest of Brunswick, out past the freeway, past the suburbs, past the last streetlights, into low hills of dry grass and scattered gum trees where the only sound at that hour is wind and insects. There is no footpath there, no shop fronts, no hundreds of windows. It is the exact opposite of the street she had trusted. Police vehicles pulled onto the shoulder of a dirt road, and their headlights lit a strip of ground beside the fence line. Officers set up lighting towers. Forensic teams pulled on suits, and in Melbourne, 300 kilometers of digital rumor away, A country that had spent 5 days sharing a photograph of a smiling woman with an Irish accent began to understand that the search was over, and that the answer was not the one anyone had allowed themselves to hope for. Black Hill Road at Gisborne South is not a place anyone finds by accident. It runs off the arterial roads northwest of Melbourne into farmland, a narrow strip of dirt and gravel with wire fences on either side. Paddocks of dry grass rolling away toward low hills and scattered gum trees standing black against the sky. There are no streetlights out there. No shop fronts, no windows. At night, the darkness is total, the kind of dark that swallows a torch beam at 20 meters, and the only sound is wind moving through dead grass and the endless dry pulse of insects. It sits roughly 50 kilometers from the footpath on Sydney Road where Jill made her last phone call. To get there, you drive north onto the Dultamarine Freeway past the airport, out through the last of the outer suburbs, and then off the sealed road onto a track where the surface changes under your tires. Police vehicles arrived on the shoulder late on Thursday, September 27th, headlights angled into the fence line. Generators were started. Portable lighting towers threw hard white light across a patch of disturbed earth beside a fallen tree. Forensic officers in white suits moved into the lit circle and began the slow, careful, methodical work of recovery, uncovering the ground centimeter by centimeter, photographing every stage, because everything they touched would one day be tested by a barrister in a courtroom. They worked through the night. Before dawn on Friday, September 28th, the search that had consumed an entire country was over. Jill was found. She was brought home. Then the investigators reassembled the 7 minutes that had cost her everything. The footage from the bridal boutique camera near the corner of Hope Street was the anchor point. She walks past. He is beside her. Hood up. Talking. The frame empties. What the camera could not show was the geography just past its field of view. Behind the shop fronts, on that block, threaded between the buildings, ran a service laneway off Hope Street. A corridor of bluestone and asphalt barely wide enough for a delivery van. Unlit, walled on both sides by the rear fences and loading doors of businesses that had been shuttered for hours. From the mouth of that laneway to the footpath was a step, one step. From the footpath to the front door of her own apartment was a few hundred meters. Between 1:38 and 1:45 in the morning, inside that narrow, dark corridor, a man she had never met attacked her and ended her life with his hands. Residents in the terraces and flats backing onto that block told detectives they had heard a woman calling out in the early hours. They heard a struggle. Then they heard the silence arrive, and it arrived too quickly. Some had assumed it was Friday night noise, the ordinary racket of a busy strip, the sound of people who had drunk too much shouting at each other on the way home. It was not that. It was a woman fighting for her life inside a city of 4 million people, 30 meters from a main road with hundreds of windows above her. He did not leave immediately. He hid her, and then he left the laneway on foot, and for the next 2.5 hours, the strip went about its business. Then, at 22 minutes past 4 in the morning, he came back. The toll road records held the movement of the Holden Astra with the neutral precision of a machine that does not care what it is recording. He returned to that laneway in his car, retrieved her, and drove her out of Brunswick, north and west, onto the freeway, out of the lit city and into the dark paddocks beyond it. Consider what that means in terms of pure chronology. At 4:30 in the morning, Tom was on the footpath outside his own building, walking the route his wife should have walked, calling her name into the mouths of laneways and getting nothing back. By then, she had already been driven away. Every hour of that 5-day search, every shared photograph, every volunteer in a park with a torch, every one of the hundreds of thousands of people who put her face on their screens and hoped was happening after the fact. He knew that. He watched the city look for her. He went to work. He went home to his house in Coburg, the suburb directly north along the same road, and he kept her SIM card inside it like a souvenir. That is the part that broke Melbourne open. There was no monster hiding in a cellar. There was a 41-year-old man in a hooded top who worked in concreting, who had a girlfriend and a mortgage and a hatchback full of tools, who bought coffee and stood in queues and nodded at his neighbors. He looked like the man who poured your driveway. He was, at that moment, a serial sexual offender under active parole supervision by the state of Victoria, with a documented history stretching back more than 20 years. Walking freely along one of the busiest streets in the city because a piece of paperwork had been left in a queue, pending an appeal. Detectives established that he had been on that strip for a long stretch of that night and had approached other women before he approached her. Any of them could have been the one. On September 28th, Adrian Ernest was formally charged. He sat still and said almost nothing while the weight of it settled around him. The toll gantry photograph, the tower data, the blue jumper, the SIM card, his own words in a 10-hour interview. A predator had been hunting in plain sight on a public road under the supervision of the system built to stop exactly that. On Sunday, September 30th, 2012, Sydney Road was closed to traffic. More than 30,000 people walked the strip in daylight, in silence, past the bakeries and the bridal shops and the mouth of the laneway off Hope Street. It was one of the largest public gatherings of its kind Melbourne had ever seen, and it was not organized by any institution. It was organized by neighbors. In April of 2013, Adrian Ernest pleaded guilty rather than force Jill's family through weeks of evidence. On June 19, 2013, the Supreme Court of Victoria sentenced him to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years. The judge described conduct of a savagery that placed it among the worst the court had seen and made clear that the guilty plea had earned him very little. Then the case kept growing. From 2014 to 2015, he was convicted of 3 further violent sexual attacks on women. Offenses from the year 2000 that had gone unresolved for more than a decade, and his minimum term was extended again. In 2016, the Court of Appeal quashed one of those convictions. His non-parole period was set at 40 years. His earliest possible eligibility date is the year 2055, when he would be in his 80s. Even that was not the end of the legal story. In November of 2023, the Victorian government introduced historic parole reforms aimed squarely at the state's worst offenders. Under the new framework, a person can be classified as a restricted prisoner, and that classification changes the arithmetic completely. A restricted prisoner can be blocked from even making a parole application for up to 10 years after the non-parole period expires, and can be refused release permanently. Adrian Ernest falls within that classification. In practical terms, the reforms mean that the man who took Jill from that footpath will almost certainly never walk out of a prison gate. The deeper legacy was structural. The Victorian government commissioned a review of the entire parole system by Ian Callan, a former justice of the High Court of Australia. What he found was not one lazy official, but a culture. The system, he concluded, had come to treat the rehabilitation of the offender as its organizing principle and community safety as a secondary consideration. The Adult Parole Board was under-resourced, opaque, and reluctant to act decisively. Its practice of waiting for an appeal to be finalized before canceling the parole of a violent offender was exactly the gap that had left a serial predator on Sydney Road. Colin made dozens of recommendations. The government accepted all of them. Breaching parole became a criminal offense in its own right. The board was restructured and given a statutory obligation to put community safety first. The presumption for serious violent and sexual offenders was reversed, so that a fresh conviction now triggers cancellation rather than a queue. Those changes exist because of one woman walking home in September of 2012, and because her family refused to let her name be attached only to what was done to her. Tom became one of the most thoughtful voices in Australia on violence against women, arguing publicly against the comfortable idea that such offenders are obvious monsters standing apart from the rest of us, because that myth is precisely what lets them move unnoticed among us. Jill's family in Ireland and in Australia carried a grief with no bottom to it, and they channeled part of it into a community fund created in her name to support women and girls. Her face is still on that road, and the lesson of her case is uncomfortable in its simplicity. The danger was never the dark, it was the paperwork. The failure in Melbourne was a failure of one system in one state, with one file left sitting in a queue. But when a predator moves between jurisdictions, when the borders themselves become the loophole, the failure multiplies. In the early 1980s, on the interstate highways of the American Midwest, thousands of young men were putting out a thumb at the edge of a road and trusting whoever pulled over, while 3 separate states failed over and over to compare their notes. In the early 1980s, the interstate highways of the American Midwest functioned as the circulatory system of an entire region. Interstate 65 ran north out of Indianapolis toward the smokestacks and steel of northwest Indiana. Interstate 57 cut south from Chicago through flat farmland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Interstate 74, Interstate 80, Interstate 94. A grid of concrete laid across corn and soybean country, connecting Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. At night, these roads belonged to long-haul truckers and to the young men standing on the shoulders with a thumb out and a duffel bag at their feet. Hitchhiking was not considered reckless in that decade. It was arithmetic. Gasoline cost money, bus tickets cost money, and a young man with $40 in his pocket did what everyone he knew had already done. He walked to the on-ramp, waited under the orange wash of a sodium streetlight, and trusted the next set of headlights. Truck stops served as the waypoints of this world, with their diesel fumes, their all-night counters, their bathrooms that smelled of industrial cleaner, and their payphones bolted to the wall near the door. Rides were traded for conversation, for gas, money, for nothing at all. The unwritten rule held that a driver who stopped for you was doing you a kindness. Thousands of these small transactions happened every single night across the Midwest, and almost all of them ended the way they were supposed to end. The young men who moved along these roads were not statistics. They were sons who called home on Sunday from a payphone with a handful of quarters stacked on the metal shelf. They were house painters and roofers and dishwashers, working seasonal jobs that ended when the weather turned, then moving on to the next town where a cousin knew a foreman who might be hiring. Some were teenagers who had graduated from high school into an economy with nothing to offer them, drifting between Indianapolis and Chicago because staying still felt like drowning. Others had left homes that no longer had room for them, and they were surviving on the margins of 2 great cities. Sleeping on couches that belonged to people they barely knew, counting the days until a paycheck cleared. They had routines. They had a favorite diner, a preferred booth, a brand of cigarette, a girlfriend they wrote letters to, a mother who kept their bedroom exactly as they had left it. They had plans that sounded modest and enormous at the same time. A trade school certificate, a used car with a working heater, an apartment with a lease that had their own name printed on it. Uptown in Chicago, the rooming houses had peeling paint on the window frames and radiators that knocked all winter, and the young men who lived in them were often invisible to the city around them. That invisibility was not a character flaw. It was a vulnerability. and it was about to be exploited by someone who had learned to read it from behind a windshield. Understand the geography, because the geography is the whole story. From a Chicago exit ramp, a driver could reach the Indiana state line in under an hour. From that state line, another hour of driving through Lake County and Newton County put him in farm country where a rural road might see 6 vehicles in a day. Drainage ditches, tree lines, abandoned outbuildings, harvested fields that would not be touched again until spring. Places where the loudest sound in August was the hum of insects in the corn and the distant drone of tractor trailers on the interstate. A man with a pickup truck and a full tank of gasoline could move between 2 states and 4 or 5 separate police jurisdictions in a single evening, and no one anywhere would log his passage. He would look like every other working man on that highway. Boots scuffed with paint, a tape measure clipped to his belt, a cooler on the seat beside him. A face you would forget before you finished pumping your own gas. That was the design. That was the entire architecture of what was coming. The roads that promised these young men freedom and anonymity offered exactly the same gifts to the person hunting them. And he understood something the police did not yet understand. In a country where each county kept its own records, a body of water, a county line, or a state border was not a boundary. It was a shield. The reckoning began on a Saturday in the middle of the Illinois harvest, October 23, 1982. Kankakee County sits roughly 60 miles south of downtown Chicago, close enough that a driver leaving the city after dark could be standing in a cornfield there before the bars closed. The field in question lay off a rural road, the kind of road where the shoulder crumbles into a shallow ditch and the corn grows right up to the edge of the gravel. In October, that corn is dead and dry, the stalks bleached to the color of paper, rattling against each other whenever the wind moves through them. Sightlines are poor at ground level and excellent from a combine cab, which is why farmers find things in autumn that were meant to stay hidden all summer. What was found in that field was a 19-year-old named Stephen Crockett. He had been left there, discarded in the open like something with no value, dozens of yards from the nearest tire tracks. Kankakee County deputies arrived to a scene with no vehicle, no witnesses, no structures, and no obvious point of origin. The nearest interstate on-ramp was a short drive away. Stephen had a family who now had to be told, and he had a future that had been taken from him by hand. The autopsy findings were what turned a local tragedy into a warning. This had not been a swift or impulsive act. Stephen had sustained more than 30 separate wounds, and 4 of those wounds were concentrated on his head. Investigators in that era had a clinical word for the pattern: overkill. The number of injuries far exceeded what was required to end a life, which told forensic pathologists something about the internal world of the person responsible. This was rage that had been rehearsed and rage that had been enjoyed. In the months that followed, deputies and state police across Illinois and Indiana began encountering the same grim signature in different jurisdictions. Young men, most of them slim and in their late teens or 20s, found in rural areas within easy reach of major highways. Some had been secured with restraints before their lives were taken. Toxicology reports told a consistent story about how they had been controlled. Alcohol appeared again and again, and so did ethchlorvinol, a prescription sedative sold under a brand name that ordinary people would have recognized from their own medicine cabinets. That detail carried a specific implication. Someone was offering these young men a drink, waiting for the sedative to take hold, and only then revealing what the ride had actually been for. They were not being overpowered by strength, they were being disarmed by hospitality. By 1983, the discoveries had spread across a map that no single police department could cover. Illinois counties, Indiana counties, sites near Interstate 65, sites near Interstate 57. Sites in farm country, where a state line was 15 minutes away. Here is where the failure begins, and it is a failure of plumbing rather than of courage. In the early 1980s, there was no national computer system that automatically compared unsolved cases across state lines. Detectives shared information by teletype, by telephone calls to counterparts they had met at conferences, and by reading newspapers from neighboring counties. A sheriff in rural Indiana had no mechanism that would flag a similar case sitting in a filing cabinet in Illinois. Each county owned its own evidence, its own reports, and its own theory of what had happened. Autopsies were performed by different pathologists using different standards. The result was that a single hunting pattern had been shattered into a dozen unrelated local mysteries, and the person responsible had done nothing to earn that protection except keep driving. When the connections finally surfaced, a multi-agency task force was assembled to pull the fragments into one file, drawing officers from Illinois and Indiana into the same room to compare notes that should have been compared a year earlier. What they saw on the wall map when the pins went in was a corridor, a predator who slept somewhere ordinary, worked somewhere ordinary, and used the interstate system the way a fisherman uses a river. They now knew he existed. Finding him would require a traffic stop, a hitchhiker willing to speak up, and a level of luck that no investigator likes to depend on. Through the summer of 1983, the task force did the work that never appears in headlines. Officers from Illinois and Indiana sat in borrowed conference rooms with cardboard boxes stacked along the walls, one box for each county, each box holding a file that had been assembled by someone who had never spoken to the detective sitting 3 chairs away. They built a chronology on a wall map with colored pins. One pin marked a rural road in Vermilion County, Indiana, roughly 20 miles north of Turvat, where an abandoned outbuilding stood in a field within sight of the highway. A 23-year-old named Stephen Agan had last been seen in Terre Haute in December of 1982, and the discovery that followed at the end of that month was made inside that structure. Stephen Agan had worked, had a family who knew his habits, and had vanished from a city where he had lived his whole life. Another pin went into Lake, County, Illinois, on August 31st of 1983. 28-year-old Ralph Calise had been left in a field a short drive from the tri-state corridor, in soft ground that had held rain earlier in the week. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Evidence technicians poured casts of 2 tire impressions and 1 boot impression pressed into that damp soil. Those casts went into a box, and the box went onto a shelf, and everyone waited for the day they would have something to compare them against. The comparison arrived by accident, in the way these cases so often turn. Interstate 65 runs a straight north and south line through Lake County, Indiana, cutting past Lowell through flat farm ground broken by tree lines and drainage ditches. On the night of September 30th of 1983, an Indiana State Police trooper working that stretch noticed a black Ford pickup parked on the shoulder in a place where no vehicle had any business stopping. 2 men were near it. One was the driver, a house painter from Indiana named Larry Eiler. The other was a young man who had been standing on an on-ramp earlier that evening, looking for a ride north. The trooper ran the license plate, and the answer that came back over the radio changed the temperature of the entire encounter. The truck was connected to a name that had already surfaced inside the task force files. So the trooper did what any conscientious officer would do. He held both men on the shoulder and radioed for the investigators who had spent a year chasing this pattern. Minutes stretched into more than an hour. While they waited, the young passenger told the trooper what had happened inside the cab. The driver had made advances. The driver had asked to bind him. The young man had refused, and the truck had pulled over. When task force investigators reached the scene and searched the pickup, they found an inventory that no working man carries. Nylon clothesline, surgical tape, handcuffs, a hunting knife carrying stains that laboratory analysis identified as human in origin. In 1983, no American courtroom had ever seen genetic profiling, so the science available was serology, the comparison of blood groups and enzyme markers, and those markers were consistent with Ralph Kalisz. Then the casts came off the shelf. The tread pattern on the boots Larry was wearing matched the impression lifted from that Lake County field, down to the wear along the outer edge of the sole. The tires on the pickup matched the second cast. Investigators looked at the man sitting in the back of the cruiser and saw exactly what they had been told to expect and had somehow still failed to imagine. 30 years old, paint on his knuckles, a quiet manner, a soft voice, a face that had passed through hundreds of gas stations without registering on a single person behind a counter. He held contract painting work in Terre Haute and in Chicago, moved between the two on a schedule nobody audited, and had a longtime companion in the city and a benefactor downstate who helped him with money. There was one more thing in the record, and it should have ended everything years earlier. In 1978, in Terre Haute, a young man had been left with wounds after an encounter with Larry, and Larry had been charged. That case closed without a conviction after an arrangement involving the young man's medical costs. No trial, no sentence, no entry in any file that a trooper on a dark shoulder of Interstate 65 would ever see. October of 1983 brought the discovery that should have made the case unassailable. Investigators turned their attention to an abandoned farm property near Lake Village in Newton County, Indiana, a place of collapsing outbuildings and overgrown ground roughly 15 minutes from the Illinois state line and a straight run from the interstate. What they found there were 4 separate grim discoveries on a single parcel. 4 young men left in a location that a stranger to the area would never have found, and a man who had spent time on that property would have known by instinct. The task force now had a corridor, a suspect, physical evidence, and a burial ground. What it did not have was a single prosecutor with authority over all of it. Newton County, Indiana, Vermilion County, Indiana, Kankakee County, Illinois, Lake County, Illinois, Cook County, Illinois. 5 separate offices, 5 separate grand juries, 5 separate evidence rooms, 5 separate elected officials, each weighing which case was strongest and which case was theirs. The decision was made to move first in Lake County, Illinois, on the Ralph Kalisz file, because the boot cast and the tire cast and the knife made it the cleanest package. Bond was set high, then argued down, and money came in from his downstate supporter. And the entire structure of that clean package rested on 1 hour of one traffic stop on the shoulder of an Indiana highway. The defense understood this before the prosecution did. Larry's attorney was a Chicago lawyer named David, a former federal organized crime prosecutor who knew that the strongest evidence in the world is worth nothing if the door it came through was locked. He filed to suppress everything. The hearing that followed was not about what was in the truck. It was about the 90 minutes before the truck was opened. In the Lake County Circuit Court, Judge William Block worked through it in sequence. Was the initial stop lawful? Yes. A vehicle parked where that pickup was parked gave the trooper every right to approach. Did that lawful stop authorize what came next? No. The purpose of the stop was a parking violation, and once that purpose was addressed, the legal basis for holding 2 men on the roadside expired. What happened instead was that both men were detained while officers waited for investigators to drive in from elsewhere. A detention justified not by anything the trooper observed, but by a name that had come back over a radio. A hunch is not probable cause. A suspicion recorded in a task force file is not probable cause. Under the Fourth Amendment, the judge ruled. The prolonged detention was unlawful, and the search that flowed from it was fruit of that unlawful act. The boots were out, the knife was out, the casts, the rope, the tape, the handcuffs, all of it out. Without them, there was no case. And in February of 1984, the charges were dropped and Larry Eyler walked out of the Lake County Jail into a Midwestern winter, a free man in the eyes of the law. The reaction inside the task force was documented rage, and it changed nothing. Larry returned to Chicago and to his painting work, and the surveillance that followed him was exactly as strong as the budgets of the departments paying for it. Detectives sat in unmarked cars outside his building through the spring of 1984, logging when he left and when he returned. And then the overtime money thinned, the multi-agency cooperation loosened, and the coverage became intermittent. Officers watched him for a stretch of days, then lost him for a stretch of days. Indiana prosecutors kept building on the Stephen Agin file slowly, because a grand jury investigation moves at the speed of paperwork and not at the speed of danger. And Larry knew all of it. He knew he had been arrested, identified, photographed, named in newspapers across 2 states, and released. He knew that the strongest evidence any of them had was now legally invisible. A man in that position could reasonably conclude that he was untouchable, and every behavior he displayed over the following months suggests that this is precisely what he concluded. He had learned the boundaries of the system. He had watched them hold. That summer, in the neighborhoods along the north side of Chicago, a 15-year-old named Danny Bridges was living the kind of life the city had no plan for. He came from a large family, and he was known to his brothers and sisters as the one who could always talk his way into a laugh. He had drifted out of the household and into the rooming houses and street corners of the north side, surviving hour to hour, appearing at his family's door and then disappearing again for days at a time. His relatives had a routine of their own by then. They asked around. They checked the places he was known to go. They waited for the phone to ring. Danny was a child by every legal measure in Illinois small for his age, and he was moving through a stretch of city where the buildings had peeling window frames and the streetlights buzzed above sidewalks that emptied out after midnight. In the middle of August of 1984, he stopped coming home. His family reported it. And a short distance away, in a quiet apartment building on a residential street where neighbors described the tenant as pleasant and unremarkable, a man the state of Illinois had already been forced to release was waiting for exactly this kind of arrival. The building sat on a quiet residential block in the Rogers Park neighborhood on the far north side of Chicago, a few blocks in from the lake, close enough that the air off the water cooled the street after sundown. It was a courtyard-style apartment building of the kind that filled that part of the city. Brick, 3 stories, wooden back stairs, a narrow gangway running along the side from the sidewalk to the rear. That gangway ended at an alley, and in that alley, perhaps 30 feet from the back door of the building, stood a dumpster. Larry Eyler lived on an upper floor. His neighbors knew him as a house painter who kept regular hours and gave no trouble. He carried buckets and drop cloths up those back stairs. He said hello. By the middle of August of 1984, the surveillance that had followed him out of the Lake County Jail 6 months earlier had thinned to almost nothing. Because overtime budgets are finite, and because a man who has been publicly identified and publicly released is, in the language of the departments watching him, a lower priority than a man they can charge. Nobody was parked on that street, nobody logged who walked up the gangway and who did not. 15-year-old Danny Bridges went up those stairs, and what happened inside that apartment happened over a period of time rather than in a moment. He was secured to a chair, he was kept there. The autopsy would later record injuries that had been inflicted across separate stages, which is a clinical way of saying that Danny understood what was happening to him and had time to hope it would stop. Then came the part that no one in either state had predicted, because it made no sense for a man who had spent 2 years exploiting geography. He did not drive. He did not use the interstate. He did not choose a harvested field in Newton County or a tree line off Interstate 57. He carried 8 plastic garbage bags down his own back stairs, walked 30 feet across his own alley, and put them in his own dumpster. On the morning of August 21st of 1984, the janitor working that building noticed the bags and noticed the smell coming off them in the August heat. He opened one. What he found made him back away from the dumpster and go inside to a telephone. Chicago police arrived within the hour and did not need long to understand what the contents of those bags represented or what had been used to reduce them to that condition. A saw was involved. That is as far as this account needs to go. What mattered to the officers standing in that alley was arithmetic and address. The dumpster served one building. The building had a finite number of tenants, and one of those tenants was a name that had been printed in newspapers across 2 states 11 months earlier, under photographs taken on the shoulder of Interstate 65. This time, nobody improvised. Investigators did not knock, did not talk their way inside, and did not detain anyone on a hunch while they waited for someone with more authority to arrive. They wrote an affidavit, took it to a judge, and obtained a search warrant for the apartment. Because every officer in that alley had watched the Lake County case dissolve over 90 minutes of unlawful detention, and none of them intended to hand the same gift to a defense attorney twice. What the warrant opened was a 2-room apartment that had been cleaned by someone in a hurry and cleaned by someone who did not understand what modern laboratories could recover. Clothing belonging to Danny, heavy with staining traces on the bathroom fixtures and along the seams of the floor that testing identified as human in origin, in places a mop could not reach. The saw and on the plastic of the garbage bags themselves, the fingerprints of the man who lived upstairs. Larry Eiler was taken into custody on August 21st of 1984. There was no jurisdictional puzzle this time. 1 city, 1 county, 1 prosecutor, 1 warrant, 1 chain of custody, with every signature in place. The predator who had used 400 miles of highway and 5 separate counties as a shield had finally been caught because he chose not to drive anywhere at all. He was 32 years old. He had a companion, a bank account contract work in 2 cities, and a landlord who had no complaints about him. That was always the horror of him. He was not a shadow at the edge of a cornfield. He was the pleasant man on the 3rd floor who carried paint up the back stairs. The Cook County trial began in the summer of 1986, and it was built on the evidence recovered under that warrant rather than on anything seized on an Indiana roadside. On July 9th of 1986, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of aggravated kidnapping, guilty of unlawful restraint, guilty of concealment of a homicidal death, and guilty of taking the life of Danny Bridges. On October 3rd of 1986, Judge Joseph Urso sentenced Larry Eiler to death. The record of that sentencing hearing includes what the state had been unable to bring into the Lake County courtroom 2 years earlier. Because at a capital sentencing, the rules of admissibility open up, and the aggravation evidence laid out the corridor, the pattern, the sedative, the restraints, the counties. Danny's family sat through all of it. They had spent the summer of 1984 calling around the north side, checking the corners where he was known to go, waiting for a telephone to ring, and they now had to listen while strangers explained in measured language what had happened in an apartment 30 feet from a dumpster. Their child had been failed by more than one man. He had been failed by a legal system that had held the responsible party in a cell in February of that year and had been compelled to open the door. Larry went to death row with knowledge that dozens of families across Illinois and Indiana desperately needed. According to his attorney, he offered to trade it. The proposal was straightforward. He would identify his victims and provide the details required to close the open files in exchange for his death sentence being reduced to life in prison. Prosecutors would not make that trade, so the files stayed open, and the family stayed in the dark, and the standoff held for years. In December of 1990, in Indiana, he did enter a guilty plea to the killing of 23-year-old Stephen Agan. The young man last seen in Terre Haute in December of 1982, whose case investigators had been building since the task force first put pins in a wall map. That plea brought an additional sentence of 60 years. It also came with his statement that another man had been present at that abandoned outbuilding, a downstate acquaintance who had given him money over the years. Indiana prosecutors took that man to trial in 1991. The jury acquitted him, whatever else that outcome established. It demonstrated the limits of a confession offered by a man on death row with something to gain. His appeals were still moving through the courts when his health collapsed. He died on March 6th of 1994 at the Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois, at the age of 41, of complications from acquired immune deficiency syndrome. He was never tried for the vast majority of what he had done. 2 days later, on March 8th of 1994, his defense attorney Kathleen held a press conference in Chicago and released the statement he had authorized her to make public after his death. In it, he took responsibility for the loss of 21 young men and boys across Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, and he described locations, methods, and circumstances with a precision that allowed investigators to close cases that had sat untouched for a decade. Families who had spent 11 years without an answer finally received one. They received it from a lawyer at a podium after the man who held it was beyond any consequence, because a bargain had been refused years earlier by officials who would not give up a death sentence to give those families the truth. Reasonable people still argue about whether that refusal was principled or cruel. The families lived with both. The work he left behind did not stop. 4 young men had been discovered on that abandoned farm property near Lake Village in Newton County, Indiana, in October of 1983. And for decades, some of them had no names. Forensic genetic genealogy changed that. In 2021, the DNA Doe Project identified 2 of them, John Ingram and William Joseph. In July of 2023, after 2 years of work building a usable profile out of severely degraded material, a third was identified as 16-year-old Keith Lavelle, which meant that every young man found on that parcel finally had a name, a family, and a place in the record. That effort reached a national audience in 2025 with the documentary series Naming the Dead, whose first episode, titled The Hitchhiker, followed the collaboration that closed those files. The lesson of the case is not complicated, and it is not comfortable. A judge in Lake County applied the Fourth Amendment correctly to a detention that officers had conducted improperly, and a 15-year-old boy in Chicago paid for that error with his life. The Constitution did not fail. The people executing it did. 19 years later, and 500 miles northwest, a different kind of release decision would be made about a different man. One documented in state files that officials had read, evaluated, and signed off on, in a trusting college town on the northern plains where residents left their doors unlocked and the winters ran to 30 degrees below zero. A 22-year-old art student named Drew Shodin was finishing her senior year at the University of North Dakota, working retail shifts at the mall to pay her way, with plans for a bigger city and a career of her own making. In late November, the wind that crosses the Red River Valley has nothing to slow it down. There are no hills in that part of North Dakota, no ridges, no forests to break the air. The land runs flat to the horizon in every direction, and by the third week of the month, the fields around Grand Forks are frozen hard, stubble poking through a thin crust of old snow. The city sits on the Minnesota border, split by the river, still carrying the memory of the great flood of 1997 in the fresh paint of rebuilt houses and the new levees along the water. It is a university town of about 50,000 people, and in 2003, it moves at the rhythm of the academic calendar. Students walk from apartment blocks to lecture halls with their coats zipped to the chin and their breath hanging in the air. Neighbors know each other by the make of their car. Doors in the older neighborhoods often stay unlocked because locking them has never seemed necessary. Parents from Minnesota and Montana send their children to school here specifically because it feels safe. In the winter, people jump each other's dead batteries in parking lots without being asked. That was the texture of the place. Ordinary, decent, and completely unprepared. Drew was 22 years old, a senior at the University of North Dakota, studying graphic arts. She had grown up in Pequot Lakes, a small resort town in the Minnesota Lake Country, about 4 hours to the southeast. The kind of place where summers mean docks and pontoons and winters mean silence. Her mother, Linda, and her father, Alan, described a daughter who filled a room without trying. She had a wide-open smile that showed up in every photograph her family owned and a habit of collecting people, drawing in the students who sat alone at the edges of things. She belonged to the Gamma Phi Beta sorority, and her sisters there talked about her the way people talk about someone who remembers your bad week and checks on you a month later. She kept sketchbooks. She thought in color and layout and typeface, and she was already looking past graduation toward a bigger city, a design studio, a career built on what she could make with her hands. She had, in the language her family used later, a future that was already taking shape. She was not a girl with a complicated life or a shadowed past. She was a young woman on a very clear road 3 semesters from the end of it. Her days ran on a schedule she kept in her head. Classes in the morning, studio work in the afternoons, then a shift at the Victoria's Secret store inside Columbia Mall on the south side of Grand Forks. The mall sits on South Columbia Road, a low brick and concrete complex ringed by an enormous asphalt parking lot, roughly 2 miles from the heart of campus. Inside, it is warm and bright and smells like pretzels and cold air tracked in on boots. The store where Drew worked faced the main contours. She folded, restocked, greeted customers, worked the register, and clocked out into the same routine every time. Out through the mall doors and across a lot that could hold hundreds of vehicles. She drove a 1994 Oldsmobile Cutlass, a heavy plain sedan that started in the cold. She also picked up shifts at a nightclub in town because tuition and rent do not pay themselves. Her phone was a small flip model, the standard of that year, and she used it constantly, calling her mother, calling her sorority sisters, calling her boyfriend Chris between one obligation and the next. That phone was the thread that tied her whole day together. It is also, in the end, the reason we know the exact minutes. Understand the world she was living in, because it matters more than anything else in this story. In 2003, the parking lot outside that mall was not blanketed with cameras. There was no phone in every pocket recording video, and the systems meant to track dangerous released offenders existed only in fragments. Each state ran its own registry, on its own terms, with its own rules about what the public could see. Those registries did not talk to each other. A man released in one state and living within a 20-minute drive of another state's college town could be undocumented. Top-tier risk on one side of an invisible line, and to the people going about their lives on the other side, effectively no one at all. Nobody in Grand Forks was checking a Minnesota list. Most people did not know such a list could be checked. There was no single national place to look. That gap, that plain administrative silence between 2 neighboring states, was not a theory or a technicality. It was a door, and in the fall of 2003, it was standing open Saturday, November 22nd, 2003. The temperature in Grand Forks hovered near freezing, and the light was already thinning by mid-afternoon, because at that latitude in late November, the sun goes down before 5 o'clock. The mall was busy with the first weekend of the holiday shopping season. Drew worked her shift and finished at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Before she left the building, she stopped at the Marshall Field store and bought a purse. Then she walked out into the parking lot. Picture the geography, because every second of what follows happens inside it. The mall entrance opens onto a broad concrete walk, then a drive lane, then row after row of parked cars stretching out under tall light poles that were just beginning to warm into that orange sodium glow. Her Oldsmobile was parked out in that field of vehicles, a walk of a couple 100 feet across open asphalt. There were shoopers coming and going. Engines idling, carts rattling. It was, by every measure, one of the most public places in the city as she crossed that lot. She dialed Chris. They talked about the evening, about what they would do later. It was a routine call, the kind she made a dozen times a day. Then the conversation stopped. Not a goodbye, not a dropped signal she called back to complain about. It simply ended in the middle of itself, and that is the precise moment the ordinary world closed behind Drew. Chris waited. He tried her again. Nothing. There was no reason yet for alarm, because dropped calls in 2003 were part of daily life, and a young woman running between a shift and her plans might have set the phone down in her bag. So the afternoon went on. The stores stayed open, the lot filled and emptied. Somewhere in those rows, a car pulled out and drove away, and nobody who saw it thought about it twice. Whatever happened in that parking lot happened fast enough that not one of the people around her registered it as anything at all. At 7:42 that evening, Chris's phone rang again. The number on the screen was Drew's. He answered, and there was no voice. He heard static. And underneath the static tones, the small electronic beeps a keypad makes when buttons are pressed, in no pattern, as if the phone were being handled by someone who did not know it was transmitting, or as if a hand had reached for the keys without being able to see them. He listened to that sound and he could not make sense of it. He tried calling back. The line gave him nothing. That call is one of the most chilling artifacts in this entire case, because it proves the phone was alive, and it proves someone was pressing those keys. And it proves that Drew was, at 7:42 in the evening, still somewhere. 3 hours and 42 minutes had passed since the call in the parking lot ended. In November. In that country, 3 hours is the difference between a busy shopping center and total darkness across 100 miles of empty farmland. She did not arrive for her shift that night. She did not answer her sisters. And here is where the people who loved Drew did everything right immediately. There was no shrugging, no assumption that she had gone off with a friend, no waiting for a mythical 24-hour window. Her friends knew her schedule and knew she kept it, and within hours they had raised the alarm and Grand Forks police were on their way to Columbia Mall. Officers found the Oldsmobile still sitting in the lot, undisturbed exactly where she had parked it. She had never reached it. And close by, on the ground, they found an object that did not belong to Drew and did not belong to anyone shopping for Christmas gifts on a Saturday afternoon. A sheath, the hard shell made to carry a knife on a person's belt, empty, discarded on the pavement of a public parking lot. In that instant, the case stopped being about a missing college student who might turn up embarrassed in the morning. Officers standing in the cold under those orange lights understood what the sheath meant. Drew had been taken, and she was out there somewhere, in the dark, in a landscape where the temperature was falling and the snow was coming. The first night belonged to the parking lot. Officers strung tape across a section of asphalt that had been full of holiday shoppers 6 hours earlier, and they worked it inch by inch under portable lights. Because the sodium poles overhead threw more shadow than illumination, the sheath was photographed in place before it was lifted. bagged, and logged. Investigators walked the drive lanes, checked the storm drains, opened the trash containers behind the loading docks, and looked under every vehicle still parked in the lot. Inside the mall, they asked for the security recordings and learned what most people in 2003 did not think about. The cameras covered the entrances and the interior concourses. They did not cover the acres of open pavement where Drew had walked. There was no image of her crossing to her car. There was no image of any vehicle beside it. Officers began knocking on the doors of every store that faced that side of the building, asking clerks and stock workers a question none of them could answer. Whether anyone had heard a shout, a scuffle, an engine, anything at all between 4 o'clock and 4:30 in the afternoon, nobody had. Her Oldsmobile was towed to a secure bay and processed for prints and trace. The keys were not in it. Drew was not in it. And the wind coming across the lot was already carrying the first dry snow of the season. By Sunday, the region had mobilized in a way nobody there had ever seen. A command post went up, and volunteers arrived faster than the people organizing them could write down names. Students from the University of North Dakota, farmers with grain trucks, retirees, hunters, snowmobile clubs, men and women who took vacation days from work and drove hours to stand in a field in Minnesota and North Dakota winter. Estimates put the number in the thousands over the following week. They were handed grid maps and sent out in lines, walking shelter belts and drainage ditches and section road culverts, opening abandoned farmhouses, checking hay bales and machine sheds and the frozen edges of sloughs. Aircraft flew low over the flatland, divers went into water. Cadver dogs were brought in, and the handlers explained the limitation to detectives plainly, that extreme cold suppresses scent and deep snow seals it under a lid. Linda and Alan stood in front of cameras almost daily, holding the photograph with the wide-open smile, asking anyone who had been at Columbia Mall that Saturday to think again about what they had seen. A reward fund was assembled and grew past $100,000. Thousands of tips came in, and every one of them had to be written up, assigned, and run out. Reported sightings placed Drade in other towns, in other states, in vehicles that turned out to belong to strangers with clean explanations. Every one of those leads ended in nothing, and every one of them consumed hours that investigators did not have. The only real trail was electronic. Drew's flip phone had connected to towers twice in a way that mattered. Once during the call to Chris that ended in the middle of a sentence. And once at 7:42 that evening when Chris heard the static and the keypad tones, investigators went to the carrier with legal process and pulled the records. Cellular networks in 2003 did not deliver a dot on a map. What they gave you was a list, which tower a handset used, which face of that tower it used, and how long. Out on the Red River Valley, there is nothing to block a signal, so the towers stand far apart, and each one covers an enormous wedge of farmland. Read in order. The records described movement. The handset had left the Grand Forks area and gone east across the river, across the state line, into Polk County, Minnesota, along the corridor of Highway 2. The last activity of consequence tied back toward a tower serving the area around Fisher, a town of a few hundred people roughly 20 miles east of the mall. That single fact reshaped the entire case. It meant the search area was not a city. It was a wedge of open country covering hundreds of square miles of section roads, ditches, ravines, and gravel pits. It also meant Drew had been taken out of North Dakota, which pulled in the Polk County Sheriff, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the Grand Forks Police Department, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 5 agencies with 5 sets of authority stitched together across an invisible line. So investigators asked the obvious question: who inside that wedge of eastern Polk County was already known to the state as dangerous? They pulled Minnesota's registry for the area and began comparing addresses against the tower coverage. One name came back at the highest level the state assigns. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., 50 years old, listed as a Level 3 registered offender, living with family in Crookston, Minnesota. Crookston sits about 25 miles southeast of Columbia Mall, a half-hour drive on dry pavement. Level 3, in Minnesota, is not a bureaucratic shading. It is the top tier, the designation reserved for the individuals the state has assessed as most likely to offend again. The category that triggers mandatory public notification meetings in the neighborhood where the person will live. His file went back to the 1970s, and it was not thin convictions for attacking women, an abduction, a blade. He had been sent to prison on a 23-year sentence built on aggravated assault, kidnapping, and a violent attack on a woman. He had served that sentence out, and on the first day of May 2003, 6 months and 3 weeks before Drew finished her shift, Alfonso had walked out of Minnesota, custody a free man. Now hold that sequence still, because this is where the failure lies, and it is not one mistake. It is a chain of them. First, Minnesota law allows the state to petition a court to civilly commit an offender at the end of a sentence if that person is judged a continuing sexual danger, holding them in a secure treatment facility instead of releasing them. Alfonso was looked at for that. The petition was not filed. Second, prison treatment programming for offenders like him existed, and he did not complete it. Third, because he had served the full term the court imposed rather than leaving early on parole. There was no supervising agent standing over him after release. No officer with authority to check his whereabouts. No condition restricting where he could drive. His obligation to the system was reduced to an address on a form. Fourth, and most infuriating of all, the community notification that his Level 3 status required was a Minnesota function, delivered to a Minnesota community, under Minnesota rules. It stopped at the border. There was no national database in 2003. There was no single website where a parent in Grand Forks could type in a zip code. North Dakota's registry did not contain him because he did not live in North Dakota. Minnesota's registry did contain him, and the people 25 minutes away who shopped and worked and parked their cars at Columbia Mall had no reason, no mechanism, and no invitation to look at it. A young woman crossed a parking lot on the wrong side of a line that existed only on paper. Investigators put Alfonso under surveillance and moved fast. On the first day of December, 9 days after the sheath came off the pavement, he was taken into custody. He denied involvement. He offered nothing that helped them find Drew. His car was seized and delivered to a laboratory bay, and technicians went through it, the way you go through a vehicle when a human life is still theoretically on the clock. They swabbed, they vacuumed, they photographed, and on the interior, they documented something that made the case a fine mist pattern of blood, the kind of dispersal produced by force, not by a nosebleed or a scraped hand. Samples went for testing, and the profile came back matching Drew's. That spray told the detectives more than a location ever could have. It told them Drew had fought inside that car, in the dark, in a moving vehicle, on a highway across the state line, and that she had understood exactly what was happening to her. Technicians also lifted and preserved fibers from the vehicle and from a blanket associated with it, and they set them aside in evidence, because fiber comparison requires two sides. They had one side. They could not complete the analysis until they had Drew's clothing. To get that, they had to find her. They could not find her. From December into January, into February, into March, the search continued in conditions that defeated it. The wedge of country east of the river was buried. Drifts along the shelter belts and in the ravines reached 5 feet. The ground beneath was frozen to a depth that made probing pointless. Searchers walked specific tracks around Crookston and along the corridor toward Fisher, and they came back with nothing. over and over. Ground-penetrating equipment was tried. Dogs were run in air too cold to hold scent. Snow fell on top of snow, then crusted, then took another layer. Meanwhile, investigators cleared the people closest to Druvo, including Chris, whose phone records and account matched the timeline exactly, and they closed out hundreds of tips that led nowhere. Linda and Alan spent Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then a New Year, and a Minnesota March without their daughter. And they kept doing interviews, and they kept saying her name. Every person working the case knew what the missed pattern in that car meant, and every person working the case understood, standing in that white silence, that whatever had happened in the hours after 7:42 on the 22nd of November was lying out there under the snowpack, and that the only thing that would ever give it back was the thaw. The thaw came late that year, through the first week of April 2004. The snowpack east of the Red River began to give up its water, and the ditches along the section roads outside Crookston ran full and brown. The country there is not entirely flat. South and east of the town, the land breaks along the Red Lake River into shallow ravines, wooded gullies cut by runoff, choked with brush and deadfall and screened from the gravel roads above by rows of trees. You can stand on the shoulder of one of those roads and see nothing but a line of bare branches and a drop in the ground. 25 miles behind you, across a state line, is the parking lot at Columbia Mall. In front of you is a fold in the earth that snow fills first and releases last. Searchers had walked that country in December and January and February. They had walked it with dogs and probes and frozen hands, and they had walked over the answer without knowing it, because 5 feet of drifted snow does not care how many volunteers are standing on top of it. On Saturday, the 17th of April 2004, a search team working a rural ravine outside Crookston made a grim discovery in the receding snow. 147 days had passed since Drew finished her shift. The recovery was slow, and it was documented by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, frame by frame. Her hands had been bound. She had been left in the bottom of that gully, in the open, in a place chosen because nobody drives past it and nobody walks down into it. The medical examiner's office took custody. The clothing that had been missing from the fiber comparison for 5 months finally came into the laboratory, and the analyst closed the loop they had been holding open since December. Fibers consistent with a blanket associated with Alfonso's vehicle were on Drew's clothing. Fibers consistent with Drew's clothing were inside his car. 2 surfaces that had touched each other, each carrying the other's signature. Combined with the fine mist of blood on the interior that matched her profile, the physical record now described the whole route. She was taken from a public lot in North Dakota. She was in that car. She fought in that car, and she was left in Minnesota, in a ravine a short drive from the house where he was living. Understand who he had been for those 6 months and 3 weeks. Not a shadow, not a stranger in a van from a warning poster. A 50-year-old man in Crookston, Minnesota, a town of 8,000 people, living with family, moving through the same grocery aisles and gas stations and streets as everyone else. He had a driver's license and a car and a full tank and nothing on his calendar. The state of Minnesota had assessed him at its highest level of risk and had written that assessment down in a file. And then the state had let his sentence expire, declined to file the petition that would have held him, sent him home with no supervising agent, and satisfied itself with an address on a form. He drove across the river whenever he wanted. He sat in a parking lot on the first big shopping Saturday of the holiday season, in a city where nobody had ever been given a reason to look him up, and he waited. That is the part that has never stopped being infuriating. He was not hiding. He was simply on the other side of a border that the paperwork could not cross. Because Drew had been carried from North Dakota into Minnesota, the case went federal. Alfonso was indicted for kidnapping resulting in death, a charge that carried the possibility of capital punishment, and the trial opened in United States District Court in Fargo in the summer of 2006 under Judge Ralph Erickson. The government laid out the tower records, the sheath from the pavement, the missed pattern matched to Drew's profile, the cross-transferred fibers, and the ravine. On the 30th of August, 2006, the jury convicted him. The penalty phase followed, and it turned on a single question: how Drew had died, because the manner of her death spoke to what she had endured in her final minutes. The Ramsey County medical examiner, Dr. Michael McGee, testified that wounds to her neck had been inflicted while she was alive. The jury recommended death in February of 2007. Judge Erickson imposed that sentence. Then the sentence began to come apart, and it came apart on the science. In post-conviction proceedings beginning in 2011, defense lawyers assembled a panel of independent forensic pathologists to review the autopsy materials the jury had never seen examined. Their conclusions contradicted the trial testimony directly. In their assessment, Drew had most likely died of suffocation, and the wounds to her neck were not inflicted by a living hand at all. They were consistent with animal activity in the months the body lay exposed in that ravine. The critical detail the jury had been given, the detail that had shaped its verdict on punishment, did not hold up. Reporting and litigation in Minnesota over those same years put Dr. McGee's work under sustained scrutiny in multiple other cases. In September of 2021, Judge Erickson, the same judge who had pronounced the sentence 14 years earlier, vacated it. He wrote that the medical examiner's testimony had been unreliable, misleading, and inaccurate, and he found that the original defense team had failed to develop evidence of Alfonso's severe post-traumatic stress. On the 14th of March 2023, United States Attorney General Merrick Garland directed federal prosecutors not to pursue death a second time. In May of 2023, Judge Erickson amended the sentence to life in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He will not be released. He will die inside. Drew's family did not wait for any of that to be finished before they went to work. Linda and Alan Shodin, along with Drew's brother Seven, took the exact mechanism that had failed their daughter and set out to close it. Their argument was simple and impossible to answer. If a state knows a man is a top-tier danger and writes it down and tells one town about it, the information is worthless to the family living 25 minutes away in a different state. On the 27th of July 2006, 5 weeks before the jury returned its verdict in Fargo, President George W. Bush signed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. Written into that law is a provision known as Drew's Law. It created the Drew Shodin National Sex Offender Public Website, a single searchable index that links the registries of every state, the territories, and participating tribal nations into one place. Any parent, any student, any person renting an apartment can now type in a zip code and see across state lines in seconds. The border that stood open in the fall of 2003 is closed. Minnesota also changed course hard after the case, filing civil commitment petitions at rates it had never approached before. Holding at the end of their sentences the men it had previously released on paper alone. It took a 22-year-old graphic arts student, a sheath on cold asphalt, and 5 months of snow to force that change. The people who searched for her have never really put it down. Thousands of volunteers walked that valley in sub-zero air for a young woman most of them had never met, and Grand Forks and Crookston and Pequot Lakes carry that season the way the town carries the flood of 1997, as a line drawn through local memory. There is a scholarship in her name at the University of North Dakota. There is a photograph her mother held up in front of cameras for 147 days. A wide-open smile that never had to be explained to anyone. Drew Shodin was 3 semesters from a design career she had already begun sketching, and she was taken by a man the system had studied. Documented, ranked at its highest tier of danger, and then simply let walk out the door. What her family built in, her name is the reason a stranger in another state cannot hide behind a filing cabinet anymore. But paperwork is only one way a system fails a young woman. Sometimes the failure is not a border or a form. Sometimes it is a man who has already been reported, already been questioned, already left a trail through the records of 2 parishes, and who is still driving the same streets when a college student rides her bicycle home from a concert on a warm Louisiana night. 9 years after Grand Forks in Lafayette, 21-year-old Michael Ashunik would ride into that gap. Lafayette, Louisiana. In the spring of 2012, moves at the pace of its own weather. The heat arrives early in May and settles in like a house guest who refuses to leave thick and wet, pressing down on the pavement long after the sun has gone. At night, the air carries the smell of cut grass and river silt, and the cicadas build a wall of sound in the live oaks that line the older streets. Downtown, the sodium streetlights throw a copper glow over brick storefronts and painted murals. Over bars where Zydeco spills out onto the sidewalk and college students stand in doorways fanning themselves with concert flyers. This is a city of about 120,000 people that behaves like a small town. People know each other's parents. They know each other's cousins. They know which crawfish place is worth the wait, and which back roads flood first when the rain comes. And in a city like that, a young woman on a bicycle at 1 a.m. is not a warning sign. She is just somebody heading home. Michaela Shunik was 21 years old, and almost nobody called her Michaela. She was Mickey. She was an anthropology student at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. The kind of student who chose that major because she was genuinely curious about people, about how they lived, what they made, what they left behind. She had a wide, unguarded smile and a stubborn streak her family recognized as their own. She worked part-time. She went to class. She kept a circle of friends so tight that they moved through the city as a single unit. Her family was close in the way Louisiana families often are, layered with siblings and cousins and Sunday obligations, and Mickey was at the center of it. Her mother, Nancy, described a daughter who was independent to the bone, who did not want to be driven anywhere, who did not want to be looked after. And Mickey had one possession that friends still talk about first before anything else: a bicycle. It was a Schwinn cutter, black and gold, a single speed, with a slim frame and no gearing to fuss over. Those were the school colors, and that mattered to her. She rode it everywhere, to campus, to work, to the coffee shops on Johnston Street, to her friends' apartments, through neighborhoods where the sidewalks buckle over old tree roots and the houses wear peeling paint on their porch columns. She rode it at night without hesitation, because she had done it 1,000 times and nothing had ever happened. Friends offered her rides constantly. She turned them down. It was not recklessness. It was a young woman in a city she trusted, on a route she could ride with her eyes closed, in a community where the streets belonged to her as much as anyone. That trust was not misplaced by her. It was violated by someone else. Friday, May 18, 2012, was the kind of night the school year ends on. Exams were finished, the semester had let go. Mickey went out with her closest friends to Artmosphere, a downtown venue that doubled as a bistro and a gallery walls crowded with local art. A small stage, a crowd that knew the band. There was music, there were people she had known for years. Later that night, the group moved on to a friend's house on Ryan Street, one of the main arteries running through the lower part of the city. A stretch of asphalt lined with utility poles and low commercial buildings that go quiet after midnight. The next day was a family day. Her brother had a graduation, and Mikey was expected there. She had every reason to want to be home and asleep. Her bicycle was outside, leaning where she had left it. Her backpack was with her. The ride home was short enough that nobody in that house thought twice about it. At roughly 1:45 in the morning on Saturday, May 19th, Mickey said goodnight and walked out onto Ryan Street. Understand the geography, because the geography is the entire tragedy. The distance she had to cover was small, a matter of a couple of miles through the heart of the city she had lived in her whole life. Her path would take her northeast through the downtown grid, past Versailles Boulevard, past St. Landry Street, over the bridge that carries traffic above the Evangeline Thruway, and into the neighborhood where she slept. On a bicycle with no gears to shift, in empty streets, that is a ride of minutes, not an hour, minutes. She had no reason to look over her shoulder. The last thing she did before leaving was tell her friends she was fine. She never arrived. Nobody knew that yet, and that is the cruelty of it. Her friends went to bed, believing she was already home. Her family assumed she was asleep in her own room. The hours between 2 in the morning and daylight passed with no alarm, no phone call, no reason for anyone to move. When Saturday morning came, the first small wrongness appeared. Her phone went to voicemail. Then it went to voicemail again. Text messages went unanswered, which was not like her. And then came the moment her family will never be able to unfeel, the moment the day tipped over. Her brother's graduation arrived, and Mickey's seat stayed empty. Mickey did not miss family. Mickey did not miss this. Whatever explanation the family had been reaching for fell apart right there in a room full of people celebrating. By that evening, the Lafayette Police Department had been notified, and a missing person case was opened on a 21-year-old college student who had vanished inside a 2-mile stretch of her own city. There was no crash site, no abandoned bicycle at the curb, no backpack in a ditch, no purse, no phone, no shoe, nothing at all. A person who had been physically present on a lit street at 1:45 in the morning had been erased from it, and the pavement offered investigators nothing to work with. What Lafayette did next became the defining feature of this case. The city detonated into action. Flyers with her face went up on light poles, gas station doors, restaurant windows, grocery store bulletin boards. Volunteers organized in parking lots at dawn. Search lines walked drainage canals and tree lines and the tall grass along the interstate online. A page created to find her drew followers by the tens of thousands within days. Thousands of strangers were now looking for one young woman on a black and gold bicycle. And in the middle of all of that noise, the first real thread appeared, and it came from a camera. Detectives put out a request that would shape everything that followed. They asked residents and business owners along her likely route to check any private surveillance system they owned, no matter how cheap, no matter how badly aimed. The recordings that came back were grainy, time-stamped, and fragmentary, and stitched together they produced a moving map of Mickey's last ride. There she was, pedaling through the downtown grid in the small hours alone, and then, in frame after frame, something else. A white 4-door pickup truck, moving along the same streets at the same time. Behind her, not passing her, not turning off following. Investigators would later establish something worse still, something they could prove from the physical damage to the rear of her bicycle. The truck had not simply been trailing her, it had made contact with her bike from behind, and that contact had been deliberate, engineered to stop her and force her to speak to the person behind the wheel. On a familiar street, minutes from her own front door, somebody had chosen her, hunted her, and taken her future. By Sunday, May 20th, the case had a shape that every investigator dreads. There was a victim, a route, and a window of about 15 minutes. And inside that window, there was nothing physical to work with at all. No collision debris left at a curb, no dropped phone, no witness who had rolled down a window and looked. Lafayette Police Department detectives set up a command structure that pulled in the Lafayette Parish Sheriff's Office, Louisiana State Police, and within days, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their first task was mundane and enormous. They had to rebuild 2 miles of city street, minute by minute, out of whatever electronic memory the city happened to have kept. So they went door to door along the corridor she would have ridden, from Ryan Street through the downtown grid, past Versailles Boulevard, along St. Landry Street, toward the overpass above the Evangeline Thruway. They asked convenience store clerks. They asked a car lot, a bar, a bank, a tire shop, a church. Anyone with a camera bolted over a doorway or aimed at a parking lot was asked to hand over the hard drive. Some of those systems recorded 4 frames a second. Some had not had their clocks reset since a power failure months earlier, which meant analysts had to calculate the drift on every single file before they could line the footage up. Officers logged hundreds of hours of video and watched it in shifts, in a room with the lights down, looking for a slim frame and a pale reflector. What surfaced from that grinding effort was the image that would define the case. Mickey, pedaling north through empty streets in the small hours. And behind her, in more than one camera's field of view, a white 4-door pickup truck. It appeared. It fell back. It appeared again. Investigators sent the clearest frames to federal image analysts who worked the grille pattern, the shape of the headlight housings, the wheel wells, the cab configuration, and narrowed the vehicle down to a family of Chevrolet crew cab pickups built in the early 2000s. Police released the images publicly, and Acadiana responded the way it had responded to the flyers. Tips poured in by the thousands. Every one of them had to be run to ground. Deputies drove out to farm roads and apartment lots and parked outside job sites to photograph white pickups. They checked bumpers for fresh damage. They checked owners against work schedules, time cards, receipts, and phone records. One by one, each of those trucks was cleared and each of those drivers was released back into anonymity, and each clearance burned days that the investigation did not have. Meanwhile, dive teams worked retention ponds. Volunteers walked drainage coals in 90-degree heat, pushing through elephant ear and briar. Cadver dogs were run along tree lines off the interstate. Nothing for 2 weeks. The case moved without moving then. In early June, the ground shifted. Roughly 20 miles east of Lafayette, Interstate 10 leaves solid land and climbs onto pilings, running for 18 miles on elevated concrete across the Atchafalaya Basin. A flooded cypress and Tupelo swamp where the water is the color of strong tea and the tree trunks stand in it like pilings themselves. Near the Whiskey Bay exit, in that water, searchers recovered a bicycle, black and gold, a Schwinn cutter. The rear of the frame carried damage consistent with being struck from behind. That single object rewrote everything investigators believed about the person they were hunting. This was not a panicked hit and run. Somebody had loaded a bicycle into a vehicle, driven it east out of the city, onto a raised highway with nowhere to pull over, and put it into the deepest, most unsearchable water within a half hour of Lafayette. That was thinking. That was a man managing a problem. It also meant the vehicle in the surveillance footage was not a coincidence, and that whoever drove it had strength time and no hesitation. The recovery gave the search a new geography and a new dread, and it gave the family the first hard proof that Mickey had not simply walked away from her own life. With the physical trail exhausted, detectives turned to paper and data, which is where this case was ultimately won. They pulled tower records for Mickey's phone and mapped the last registrations before it went silent. They pulled tower data for every device that had transacted through the same cell sites during her ride, a list thousands of numbers long, and began filtering it against devices that also appeared along Interstate 10 going east in the hours afterward. At the same time, analysts ran a separate query And this is the query that mattered. They cross-referenced the state registry of convicted offenders living in and around Lafayette Parish against motor vehicle records for white pickup trucks. That comparison returned a name Brandon Scott, 33 years old, living out past the edge of town where the subdivisions give up and the rice fields start. He worked, he was engaged. His neighbors would later describe a polite, unremarkable man who waved from his driveway. He was, by every outward measure, a normal person in a normal life, and that is precisely why nobody had looked at him. On the registry, he was listed as the owner of a white Chevrolet Z71 crew cab pickup. Here is where the record turns infuriating, because Brandon Scott was not an unknown quantity to the state of Louisiana. In the late 1990s, he had been accused of taking a young woman against her will and assaulting her in Acadia Parish, the rural parish immediately west of Lafayette. That case did not go to a jury. It resolved through a negotiated plea to a reduced charge, which capped the sentence he faced, and he served his term and walked out. The obligation that followed him out the gate was registration. Under Louisiana law, he was required to keep his address current, report changes in employment, and keep his vehicle information updated with the sheriff of the parish where he lived. Read that again. The system designed to monitor a man who had abducted a woman off a road depended almost entirely on that man voluntarily filling out accurate forms about where he slept and what he drove. There was no tracking device, no supervision officer riding along. Verification happened on a schedule, which means a registrant can drift out of compliance and stay there for a stretch before anybody notices. The file is stale. And there was something else nobody had connected. In 1999, a woman named Lisa Marie Pott had disappeared from that same rural stretch of Acadia Parish. Her case went cold. Her file sat in a drawer for 13 years in a different parish, under a different agency, never cross-indexed against the abduction case that had put Brandon Scott on the registry in the first place. Then investigators found the hospital record, and the timeline snapped into place with a sound you could almost hear. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, May 19th, roughly 13 hours after Mickey rode away from Ryan Street, Brandon Scott checked into a hospital in Jefferson Parish, more than 120 miles east of Lafayette, on the far side of Baton Rouge, in the suburbs of New Orleans. He was carrying deep wounds to the chest that required emergency treatment. He told the staff and the responding local officers a story about being set upon and robbed by strangers. And nothing happened. He was treated. The report was taken, and it went into a Jefferson Parish filing system. There was no mechanism, none, that flagged a man arriving in one parish with fresh wounds and a thin explanation against a missing person case that had just opened in a parish 2 hours west. Different agency, different jurisdiction, different database. Two facts that together were a confession sat in two separate buildings for weeks. And in that same period, Brandon Scott made his own vehicle disappear. He and a family member drove the white Z71 out of Louisiana and across Texas to San Jacinto County north of Houston, and it was burned there. Detectives eventually documented the site and the ruined hulk. Then they pulled the dealership paperwork and found what he had done next. He had gone out and purchased a white four-door pickup that looked nearly identical to the one he had destroyed. A mirror image, a replacement mask for a vehicle the entire state was hunting. The relative who helped move that truck was later accused of obstruction. Detectives searched that replacement truck, and inside it, they found a plain white envelope. Written on it was a cell phone number. It belonged to Nancy Shunick, Mickey's mother. Her number was on the missing person flyers stapled to light poles across Lafayette. His fingerprints were on the envelope. He had walked up to one of those flyers in a city that was searching itself street by street for a young woman, and he had taken her mother's phone number with him. Sit with that. and from the wound records, the damage to the bicycle and what was eventually recovered. Investigators were able to reconstruct what had happened on that dark street in the 15 minutes nobody saw. The truck struck the rear of her bike from behind deliberately because a collision creates an obligation to stop and talk. Mickey stopped, and Mickey fought. She carried mace, and she used it. She got hold of the blade the man behind the wheel had brought with him, and she turned it on him, and she put those wounds in his chest herself. She was 21 years old, 5 feet tall alone at 2 in the morning, and she made him pay a price he could not hide. That fight is the only reason there was ever a hospital record. That fight is the reason the case broke. By the end of June, the pieces stopped being scattered. Cell site data placed a device tied to Brandon Scott along the corridor Mickey had ridden. In the window she wrote it, and then moving east in the hours that followed. Motor vehicle records placed a white Chevrolet crew cab in his name. Dealership paperwork placed a nearly identical replacement in his driveway within days of the first one being reduced to a shell in the pine country of San Jacinto County, Texas. And a hospital chart in Jefferson Parish placed him on a treatment table with deep chest wounds and a story that did not survive contact with a timeline. Investigators drove out past the last subdivision on the western edge of Lafayette Parish, where the pavement narrows and the rice fields open up flat to the horizon. And they looked at a house with a truck parked beside it, and a man inside who mowed his lawn and went to work and was engaged to be married. Now sit with what they could actually arrest him for on July 5, 2012. Not abduction, not homicide. A warrant for failing to keep his offender registration current. The state of Louisiana had a convicted abductor in its files, and the only immediate legal hook it could put in him was a form he had not filled out correctly. The charges came after. First, he was booked on the registration violation, and then, as the case file thickened, prosecutors filed the most serious homicide charge Louisiana law allows along with aggravated kidnapping. Detectives kept pulling records, and the records kept getting colder. In the hours before Mickey rode home, Brandon Scott had placed roughly 24 calls to services that advertise paid companionship. 24. He had been looking for a woman that night in the way a man looks for a parking space, working down a list, and when the list did not produce one, he got into the truck and went out into the streets of a college town at 1 in the morning and found one on a bicycle. Then came the detail that made even the investigators go quiet. In the days after May 19th, his future father-in-law had noticed a smell in his vehicle and asked about it. Brandon Scott did not deflect. He answered with a remark about how badly a person can smell, as though he were commenting on the weather. He said it out loud, to family, in a normal voice, in a normal kitchen, in a normal week. That is the whole horror of this man. He had no cave. He had no lair. He had a fiancée, a job, a driveway, and neighbors who waved at him while the entire city of Lafayette stapled flyers to light poles looking for the young woman he had taken. He had walked up to one of those flyers and copied her mother's phone number onto an envelope and carried it around in his truck. Faced with the video, the tower data, the burned truck, the envelope, the wounds, and a district attorney preparing to seek the death penalty, his defense had nowhere left to stand. So the negotiation began, and it turned on the one thing he still owned. He knew where she was. The family had spent 2.5 months walking canals and tree lines and had been given a bicycle out of the Atchafalaya, and nothing else. So the agreement was built around information. In exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, he would give up locations. On August 7, 2012, a convoy left Lafayette and drove north and west, up out of the flat rice country and into Evangeline Parish, where the land begins to roll and the highways run between stands of pine and long gaps of nothing. Off Louisiana Highway 10, past a gravel turnoff, there is a small country cemetery, the kind that serves 3 or 4 families and gets visited twice a year. Old headstones, a sagging fence line, grass and briar grown high enough to hide a person from the road. He walked officers to a spot on that ground and stopped. It had been 80 days. She had been lying there the entire time. Roughly an hour from the front porch where her family had been waiting, in a place chosen because nobody had any reason to look at it. On August 17th, 2012, 10 days after that drive to Evangeline Parish, Brandon Scott stood in a Lafayette courtroom and pleaded guilty, not to 1 homicide to 2. He admitted taking Michael Ashunik from a downtown street in May of 2012, and he admitted taking Lisa Marie Pate from Acadia Parish in 1999, a case that had sat cold for 13 years in a different parish, under a different agency, with no line drawn between it and the abduction conviction that had put him on the registry in the first place. And here is how investigators knew he was telling the truth about Lisa Marie rather than simply buying his way off the gurney. He described using a plastic bag. That detail had never been released. It had been held back on purpose, because when she was found beneath wooden boards on rural ground in Acadia Parish, forensic examiners had documented traces of melted plastic with her. A closely guarded fact, volunteered by the only person who could have known it. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms at hard labor, without the possibility of parole, without probation, without suspension of sentence. 2 lives, 2 sentences stacked end to end, with no arithmetic that ever lets him out. For the Ashunik family, the verdict closed a legal file and closed nothing else. Nancy Ashunik had spent 80 days as the public face of a search, standing in front of cameras, asking a city to keep looking for her daughter, and had ended it standing over a country cemetery in Evangeline Parish. What that family did with the years after is the part of this story worth keeping. They pushed for cyclist safety, for better lighting and safer routes, and the plain recognition that a young woman riding home should not be treated as a risk she took. Rides were organized in Mickey's name. Her friends kept her memory in circulation the way she had kept them together in life as a single unit. And Lafayette learned something about itself. The break in this case did not come from a fingerprint on a doorframe or a witness who happened to be awake. It came from hundreds of ordinary people handing over the hard drives from cheap cameras bolted above their shop doors, and from analysts sitting in a dark room correcting clock drift file by file until 2 miles of city street could be watched minute by minute. That is what convicted him, a community that kept its receipts. But the failures in this case deserve to be named plainly, because they were not bad luck. A man accused in the late 1990s of taking a woman off a road resolved that case through a negotiated plea to a lesser charge, served his term, and walked out under a monitoring scheme that depended on his own honesty about his address, his job, and his vehicle. No tracking device, no officer riding along verification on a calendar, which means a file can go stale and stay stale. When he checked into a hospital in Jefferson Parish at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of May 19th, more than 120 miles from Lafayette, carrying wounds to the chest and offering a thin story about being robbed. That report went into a local system and stopped there. No flag reached the parish where a young woman had disappeared 13 hours earlier. 2 facts that together amounted to a confession sat in 2 buildings in 2 jurisdictions under 2 agencies for weeks, and the 1999 case in Acadia Parish was never cross-indexed against the conviction that should have made it obvious. The system did not fail once in this case. It failed in 1999. It failed at the plea table. It failed at the registration desk. And it failed again in a hospital emergency room. As for the man himself, the arrogance did not end at sentencing. He was sent to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, the vast farm prison in a bend of the Mississippi River where the fields run to the levee and the horizon is fence line. He staged a hunger strike that lasted 4 days. In October of 2018, he attempted to escape and was caught before he ever reached the perimeter fence. He filed appeal after appeal on his own behalf, arguing that his guilty plea had been coerced, that the deal had been forced on him, that the confession he traded for his life did not count. On October 3, 2023, the Louisiana Supreme Court denied his supervisory writ. That was the last door. As of August of 2026, he remains in restricted custody, and the record is closed. Mickey was 5 feet tall, 21 years old, and alone on a dark street, and she still marked him so badly that he had to seek treatment in another parish. She is the reason there was a paper trail at all. She solved her own case 5 cases. 5 men and women who were already known to the system, already documented, already flagged in some file that somebody had read and signed. Every one of them was released or supervised on paper or quietly reclassified. And every one of them went on to take something that could never be given back. So let us step back from the individual stories and look at what they have in common. Because the pattern that connects them is not a coincidence, and it is not finished. Five files, 5 doors that should have stayed shut in every one. The paperwork was correct. The protocol was followed. And a person who had already shown us exactly who he was walked back into the daylight. So the question is not whether the system failed. It is how many quiet risk assessments are being signed off tonight. Thank you for watching. The next case is waiting on your screen.